Initial takeaways that the disaster wasn't prevented, the disaster didn't happen. The meeting was in a constructive, positive atmosphere. There were no public spats, there were no public arguments, no public discussions. There were a lot of smiles and even jokes, which was a big contrast from the previous meeting in February. However, I would say that also we should be quite cautious about possible progress achieved at this meeting. Let's see how the events develop in the next days. I think in his eyes, Trump is playing a role of the mediator. So certainly he does not see himself as aligning with either side. However, I would say that it's easy, it's not very hard to kind of sway Donald Trump and to manipulate his position. He clearly does not have a very deep understanding of history of relations between Russia and Ukraine, of history of violated agreements, of promises that were broken by Russia, or maybe he doesn't really care about that much. He sees the situation in kind of a very black and white manner. So he sees a big country, a much bigger country with a bigger army, with vaster resources, a nuclear armed country that dominated also its neighbor for many, many years and centuries. And then there is this underdog, Ukraine, that has been fighting quite bravely, as Trump himself admits, for the last 3.5 years, but also he kind of knows that Ukraine has been fighting bravely and was able to resist thanks to the help and thanks to the support that the United States, among others, was providing. But I'm not sure, Donald Trump agrees kind of with this vision of Russia as an adversary, the vision that obviously the Europeans have and that Ukrainians have. So Donald Trump believes Russia can be a partner. He believes Vladimir Putin is someone he can work with, he can make deals with, maybe business deals or some other deals. So kind of persuading him that Russia is an adversary, not just of Ukraine, not just of Europe, but it remains an adversary of the United States and needs to be treated as such, is a really difficult task that both Zelensky and the European leaders will have to have in the future. And actually, I would say we should be cautious with these statements from the Kremlin saying they are ready to level up the level of representation. Let's see if actually they agree to this meeting between Putin and Zelensky, because we know that in the past, Putin has been really, really reluctant to have any meetings with Volodymyr Zelensky because he does not see him as a legitimate leader, as a legitimate president. He does not see Ukraine as, a country, a separate sovereign and independent state and a legitimate entity. And the fact that President Trump now kind of wants to skip that stage of a ceasefire, despite his previous statements, that he wants a ceasefire in Ukraine, despite the previous ultimatums he issued to Russia, that Russia must agree to a ceasefire, I think is a kind of dangerous step, because it indicates that he is more inclined to just take Russia's words at face value, to trust President Putin and his words, and he is willing to skip that stage of Russia actually showing on the ground that it is ready for peace before discussing a peace deal. Ukraine might agree to some concessions and to make some compromises, but it needs to be sure that there will be very strong, robust security guarantees in place to prevent Russia from launching another aggression, from launching another invasion in some time in the future. And Ukraine also, I still think it will not be ready to compromise on some very, very critical points, on some very critical issues. And one of them is the withdrawal from Donetsk region. I think this is something that is completely unacceptable for Ukraine, because it would mean abandoning some of the most fortified positions, abandoning the region that Russia has not been able to occupy in more than 11 years, abandoning people who live there to Russian occupation, repression, deportation, and so on. I'm cautiously optimistic after yesterday's meeting, but I do not have very high expectations that there is peace on the horizon and that a peace deal can be achieved anytime soon. I think, again, it will all the bottom line is, how to make Russia feel that the continuing the war is unsustainable, that the cost of continuing the war is too high. And I do not think that Russians at the moment feel that the cost of war is too high from them.
The outcome, I think, is on the one hand, first of all, positive. We have seen that Europe speaks with a united voice. We have seen that Trump is taking that into consideration. And we have seen that Zelensky's, let's say, demands were at least regarded also as appropriate. Second, I think what is also very, very important is there will be follow-up talks, or at least that is the plan at the moment. And I think talking about peace is always better than making war. What is, of course, really a problem at this stage is we have no ceasefire. So that means Trump, in a way, succeeded in muddling through this, in a way pointing it away, saying, he understands Putin, that he does not want it. So I think this is the critical issue, because, of course, when one party takes it as a precondition to have a ceasefire and the other one doesn't want it, there will be problems for further talks. So I'd say peace will be a long way. So that is not something that will be achieved within the next couple of weeks. But coming to the ceasefire, I think there it's very important in a way to distinguish different aspects, because we have on the one hand an air war against Ukraine, against civilian targets. This is a huge problem for Zelensky, and this is also perceived in Europe in a way as that they are increasingly under pressure. So on the other hand, we have the front line, the battlefield in the east. So here there's basically no progress. It's not much more than what allies were doing in the Battle of the Somme in 1916. So it's 80 meters a day. So it's a catastrophe or a disaster for the Russians, to be honest. So what could be the precondition for a ceasefire could be, of course, at least you stop the air war. But I think it's quite obvious that the battle in the east will continue to some extent. I think when these leaders meet and talk about war, it's never just about symbols. It's very important to say, it's important to be back on track. It is important to at least develop a plan of how a final agreement could look like. And it's also important in a way to align among yourself, to be clear, we speak with a single voice. At the same time, of course, it's not a breakthrough. Putin has not agreed to anything, and we will see in the next couple of days what he thinks he will do. But I think it's important now to be right on track. But I think what is very important is that the demand of Putin that in a way Ukraine should give up its fortifications in the east and in the south a bit is impossible. So they will never do it. We have seen it here years or decades ago in Munich, when Czechoslovakia was doing that before the Second World War. It was basically lost when the war started. So this is a non-go red line. Second, then, of course, what Putin wants to have is Crimea. And the question is, to some extent, is he satisfied of getting Crimea de facto, as he has at the moment, or does he also want to have a de jure recognition by the community of states? That could be something that would be something that one could give to Putin. And then, of course, there's all the rest. And this is, in the end, question of peace talks and it's clear both sides will have to make concessions to achieve peace. And it's quite clear, I think, that there's one language that he understands, and that is pressure. And that is, a combination of military and economic pressure. So that means, in a way, it's key that the Americans are in. It is key that secondary sanctions stay on the agenda. And it is then also key that, of course, the Europeans help to implement an agreement. It has not agreed to anything. and we will see in the next couple of days. Hat ist ganz interessant. Ich meine, seit seinem Amtsantritt ja quasi nichts an. Trump really needs those peace talks. So Alaska was not driven by his wish to, or maybe a bit by his wish to get the Nobel Prize, but it's very much, he is under domestic pressure. The Senate, and there's a majority of over 80 senators who want to give, or who have decided to establish secondary sanctions when there is no ceasefire.